History often remembers women in power as exceptions, anomalies, footnotes in a narrative written by men. But Maria Theresa was not an exception. She was a rupture. She did not rule quietly. She did not wait for permission, and she did not inherit a world ready for her authority. She inherited resistance. This is not a story about a woman who happened to rule. This is the story of a woman who forced power to redefine itself. In the 18th century, Europe was built on assumptions that sovereignty was masculine, that authority required a male body, that continuity depended on sons. Maria Theresa challenged all three, not with ideology, but with survival. She ruled for 40 years. She governed one of the largest and most complex empires in Europe. She gave birth to 16 children while restructuring the state. She led during war, reform, and crisis. And yet, for much of history, she has been reduced to a paradox, a mother empress, a conservative reformer, a powerful woman who ruled without ever being crowned, Holy Roman Empress in her own right. This contradiction is precisely where her importance lies, because Maria Theresa did not simply occupy power. She renegotiated what power looked like when worn by a woman. Her reign forces uncomfortable questions. Can authority exist without formal legitimacy? Can maternal identity coexist with political dominance? And what happens when a woman rules an empire that was never designed for her body? To understand Maria Theresa, we must abandon romantic portraits and imperial myths. We must see her as she was, a ruler shaped by fear, resistance, and relentless expectation, a woman who learned to govern under siege, a sovereign whose authority was constantly tested and constantly proven. This is not a story of triumph without cost. It is a story of endurance. Because Maria Theresa did not inherit stability, she built it, while the world waited for her to fail. Maria Theresa was born into privilege, but not into certainty. From the moment of her birth in 1717, her life was defined by a contradiction. She belonged to one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, yet she embodied its greatest anxiety. The House of Habsburg ruled vast territories across Central Europe. Its authority rested on inheritance, tradition, and, above all, male succession. And Maria Theresa was not male. Her father, Emperor Charles VI, had no surviving sons. This was not a private disappointment. It was a political emergency. For years, the stability of the empire depended on a single legal instrument, the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713. Its purpose was simple in theory and radical in practice. It declared that Charles VI's daughters could inherit the Habsburg lands. Europe's court signed it. They swore to recognize it. They nodded, agreed, and waited, not for her to grow strong, but for the moment she would become vulnerable. Maria Theresa was raised knowing she was important, but never taught she would rule. Her education reflected this ambiguity. She was trained in etiquette, religion, languages, and courtly behavior. She learned music and dance. She learned how to represent power, not how to wield it. There was no formal preparation for sovereignty, no instruction in military strategy, no lessons in diplomacy as command, because no one truly believed she would need them. In the Habsburg court, Maria Theresa was visible, admired, and celebrated, but not taken seriously as a future ruler. Her body symbolized continuity. Her mind was not expected to govern it. This mattered, because when power finally arrived, it did not arrive as a crown placed gently on her head. It arrived as crisis. She grew up inside a system that depended on her existence, yet refused to imagine her authority. This tension shaped her entire reign. From childhood, she learned obedience, piety, and restraint. But she also learned something more dangerous, that survival would require force, not physical force, but persistence. Maria Theresa did not inherit confidence in her legitimacy. She inherited doubt, and that doubt would follow her into adulthood, into marriage, and eventually into war. By the time her father died in 1740, Europe was ready to question her right. ready to fracture her inheritance, ready to test whether a woman could hold what men had built. She was 23 years old, pregnant, unprepared by design, and yet this was the moment history had been waiting for, not to crown her, but to see if she would collapse. When Emperor Charles VI died in October 1740, Europe did not mourn. It calculated. For nearly 3 decades, Charles VI had worked obsessively to secure his daughter's inheritance. The pragmatic sanction was not a symbolic gesture. It was a diplomatic campaign. He negotiated. He promised. He traded favors. He extracted formal recognition from Europe's major powers. On paper, Maria Theresa's succession was guaranteed. In reality, it was conditional. The moment Charles VI's body was buried, those conditions dissolved. What followed was not confusion. It was opportunity. Maria Theresa inherited an empire that looked vast on maps, but fragile in structure. Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, the Austrian Netherlands, Lombardy, a composite state held together by tradition rather than unity. And now it was ruled by a woman, a young woman, a pregnant woman, an untested woman. Europe's rulers did not question the law itself. They questioned whether it could be enforced by her. Prussia moved first. Frederick II, newly crowned and ambitious, invaded Silesia without warning. He did not declare war. He assumed weakness. Bavaria followed, challenging her claim to the imperial title. France supported the challenge. Spain circled from the south. What had been promised as succession turned into dismemberment. Maria Theresa was not stepping into power. She was stepping into collapse. Her treasury was empty. Her army was disorganized. Her generals doubted her. Her advisors underestimated her, and yet she refused to negotiate her existence. This moment defined her reign, because Maria Theresa understood something immediately and instinctively. Legitimacy would not be granted to her. It would have to be demonstrated. She did not frame herself as an exception. She framed herself as necessity. In Hungary, she stood before the nobility, dressed in mourning black, holding her infant son in her arms. She did not argue law. She appealed to loyalty, tradition, and emotion. And it worked. The Hungarian estates pledged soldiers and support, not because the law compelled them, but because she compelled them. This was the beginning of her real education, not in theory, but in survival. The War of the Austrian Succession was no accident. It was the world's response to a woman refusing to disappear. And Maria Theresa did not retreat. She hardened. When Maria Theresa came to power in 1740, there was no moment of ceremonial clarity. She did not gain universal acceptance. She did not receive unified approval. There was no smooth transition process. There was simply a sense of urgency. The accession to the throne did not feel like an inheritance. Rather, it felt like the occupation of a position that the world did not think one belonged to. The language used around his rule told a lot. He was not described as a sovereign, but as an heir. Not as a ruler, but as a protector. Not as an authority, but as an interim ruler, until a man could take control. From the very beginning of her reign, Maria Theresa understood a fundamental truth. Power would not wait for her to learn this. During his reign, he had to be a ruler, not before that. The palace was divided. Many advisors doubted his commandability. Some were questioning whether obedience to him was temporary or necessary. Even those who supported him often did so conditionally, as long as he listened, as long as he obeyed, as long as he accepted their guidance. However, Maria Theresa did not rule hesitantly. She ruled with determination. Her first political decisions were not grand reforms. They were acts of containment. She worked to secure loyalty within her territories before, confronting her enemies abroad. She replaced advisors who treated her authority as symbolic. She demanded reports, accountability, and presence. Most importantly, she made herself visible, not as spectacle, but as permanence. She appeared in councils, She listened in silence, then decided decisively. She resisted the urge to soften her authority for comfort. This was not instinct, it was adaptation, because Maria Theresa was governing in a paradox. She was expected to project strength, but punished for appearing forceful. She was expected to embody virtue, but judged harshly for ambition. Her body itself became political terrain. She was pregnant during the earliest months of her reign, a fact widely discussed, closely observed, and openly weaponized. To her critics, pregnancy was evidence of distraction. To her allies, it was a liability to be managed. To Maria Theresa, it became something else entirely, a reminder that her authority would never be abstract. She governed while visibly female, visibly embodied, visibly vulnerable, and therefore relentlessly scrutinized. She did not attempt to neutralize this scrutiny. She redirected it. In public appearances, she emphasized dignity and restraint. Her clothing became deliberately severe, her gestures controlled, her language precise. She did not imitate male rulers. She did not adopt theatrical masculinity. Instead, she created a new visual grammar of rule, one that communicated seriousness without aggression, legitimacy without coronation, command without concession. This was not merely personal style, it was strategy, because Maria Theresa understood that authority, when denied institutionally, must be built symbolically. She spoke less and listened more in public forums. But when she spoke decisively. She framed her decisions as necessity rather than preference, as preservation rather than innovation. In doing so, she repositioned herself not as a disruptor, but as the only possible stabilizer of a fragile system. Her early reign was marked by constant movement. She traveled across her lands to assert presence. She addressed estates and assemblies directly. She appealed not to abstract law, but to continuity. He repeatedly emphasized the same idea. The empire did not belong to him personally, but it required his survival. This distinction was important. It enabled him to establish authority without arrogance, gaining power without demonstrating performance. At the same time, Maria Theresa learned to rapidly centralize the decision-making process. She reduced the autonomy of regional elites. He demanded standardized management. He insisted that loyalty be measurable. These actions were not very popular, but they were effective because while their enemies were expecting indecision, they encountered his determination. His myth of weakness was not shattered by a dramatic victory, but by his endurance. He did not disappear. He did not abdicate. He did not surrender. And as the months turned into years, something subtle yet profound occurred. His authority became habitual. Things that were once questioned have now become routine. Things that were once conditional have now become assumed. The reason for this was not the change in the system, but the change in it. Maria Theresa did not seize the throne through conquest or ceremony. She obtained it by refusing to abdicate. In doing so, she transformed expectations regarding women's power, not by advocating equality, by holding on to power until the resistance was exhausted. This was the foundation of his reign, not idealism, not a revolution, but existence. When Maria Theresa married Francis Stephen, Prince of Lorraine, this union was presented as ideal. A dynastic marriage, a political alliance, a promise of continuity. However, the marriage carried an imbalance that was not expressed from the very beginning. Francis was given the title of Holy Roman Emperor years later, but true power did not come with the crown. Maria Theresa ruled. Francis Stephen also accompanied this marriage. This situation caused concern in Europe because the marriage did not fit the expected scenario. The husband did not rule the country through his wife. The wife governed the country despite her husband. And yet Maria Theresa never attempted to abolish the institution of marriage. She used it. In the 18th century, marriage was not a private agreement. It was a political structure, and Maria Theresa was aware of its public visibility. In public, she portrayed herself as a devoted wife. In private, she held ultimate authority. This dichotomy was not coincidental. It was a struggle for survival, because female dominance could only be tolerated when presented as an exceptional case, and the exception required guarantees. This assurance was maternal. Over the course of her life, Maria Theresa gave birth to 16 children. This fact has often been romanticized or trivialized, but in reality, it was political labor. Each pregnancy was public knowledge. Each birth was observed, reported, and evaluated. Her body became a site of state interest. Fertility was proof of legitimacy. Sons were evidence of stability. And Maria Theresa delivered both repeatedly. But motherhood did not soften her rule. It intensified it. She governed while pregnant. She signed decrees between confinements. She returned to council meetings weeks after childbirth. There was no separation between ruler and mother. There was only accumulation. This constant visibility of the maternal body reshaped how power was perceived. Her authority was never abstract. It was embodied. She ruled not from distance, but from presence. And this presence unsettled the political imagination of Europe. Because while male rulers could rely on invisibility, Maria Theresa could not. Her physical state was read as political signal, strength or weakness, stability or risk, continuity or collapse. She learned to control this reading. Her public appearances were carefully staged. Her clothing concealed vulnerability. Her posture communicated endurance. She did not deny pregnancy. She neutralized its interpretation. At the same time, she exercised control over her children's futures with uncompromising clarity. Her daughters were not raised for autonomy. They were raised for alliance. Marriage negotiations began early. Personal preference was secondary to state necessity. Maria Theresa was affectionate, but not permissive. She believed deeply in duty, and she expected her children to embody it. This tension was especially visible in her daughters. They were educated carefully, monitored closely, and married strategically. Their bodies, like hers, became instruments of continuity. This was not hypocrisy in her mind. It was coherence. Because Maria Theresa did not see motherhood as emotional fulfillment alone. She saw it as governance. The family was not separate from the state. It was its smallest administrative unit. And yet this vision came at a cost. Her marriage, though stable, was not equal. Her children experienced pressure rather than freedom. Her maternal authority mirrored her political rigidity. She was capable of warmth, but not indulgence. Because indulgence threatened order, Maria Theresa's motherhood was not idealized. It was disciplined. And in this discipline, we see the limits of her world. She did not imagine liberation through family. She imagined survival through structure. This is where modern interpretations often hesitate. Was she a feminist icon? No, not in intention. Was she a conservative enforcer of hierarchy? Yes, but not without contradiction. She lived inside the structures available to her, and she mastered them. Marriage did not diminish her authority. Motherhood did not interrupt it. Instead, both became tools through which she stabilized rule in a system that resisted her presence. Maria Theresa did not separate private and public life. She fused them. And in doing so, she demonstrated a truth that remains uncomfortable, that for women in power, the body is never neutral. It is read, interpreted, used. Maria Theresa did not escape this reality. She governed through it. By the mid-1740s, Maria Theresa had managed to overcome the most urgent threats to her reign. However, survival was not enough. The wars of succession had revealed something far more dangerous than foreign enemies, the internal weakness of the Habsburg state. The empire it governed was vast but inefficient. Power was fragmented. The management was inconsistent. Taxation was unfair and unreliable, and loyalty became fragile when not structured. Maria Theresa understood that an authority based solely on personal presence could not be enduring. If her rule was to continue beyond crises, it needed to be institutionalized. Reform was not for her an ideological project. This was a necessity born out of fatigue. He did not dream of a new world. He sought to stabilize the world he had inherited. The first goal was governance. For centuries, the Habsburg lands functioned as a loose collection of territories, each with its own laws, privileges, and power structures. Local elites enjoyed autonomy. Central control was minimal. This system was working until it was tested. During war, delays were deadly. During crisis, decentralization became paralysis. Maria Theresa moved to change this. She strengthened central bureaucratic institutions. She demanded standardized reporting. She reduced the discretionary power of regional nobles. These measures were deeply unpopular. Local elites saw reform as intrusion. Privileges once assumed were now questioned. Authority was no longer symbolic. It was administrative. Maria Theresa did not soften these changes with rhetoric. She framed reform as protection of stability, protection of order, and most importantly, protection of survival. Taxation followed administration. For the first time, nobles were required to contribute more consistently to state finances. The idea that privilege exempted one from obligation was quietly dismantled. This was revolutionary, not in language but in practice, because it redefined the relationship between power and responsibility. The army was next. The wars had revealed a painful truth. The Habsburg military was outdated. Command structures were inefficient, training inconsistent, supply unreliable. Maria Theresa invested heavily in military reform. She standardized recruitment, improved training protocols, strengthened logistical organization. This was not militarism for expansion. It was defense through competence. She did not seek glory on the battlefield. She sought preparedness. Education reform followed, perhaps her most enduring legacy. Maria Theresa believed deeply in order, discipline, and moral structure. She did not believe in ignorance. In 774, she introduced compulsory primary education for children across much of her realm. This decision was not motivated by egalitarian idealism. It was motivated by governance. An educated population was more predictable, more productive, more governable. Education was framed as moral instruction as much as intellectual development. Religious values were embedded. Obedience was emphasized, but literacy expanded, and with it the capacity of the state to function. Maria Theresa's reforms extended into public health, legal administration, and economic regulation. She sought consistency over creativity, uniformity over autonomy. These reforms shared a common logic. The state must be legible to itself. Every subject counted, every territory recorded, every function supervised. This was modern governance taking shape cautiously, conservatively, and deliberately. Yet reform had limits. Maria Theresa did not question hierarchy itself. She reinforced it. She did not imagine political participation. She imagined compliance. Freedom was not her goal. Stability was. And here lies the tension at the heart of her reign. She modernized the state while preserving inequality. She expanded education while limiting thought. She strengthened institutions without democratizing them. This was not contradiction in her mind. It was coherence. Because Maria Theresa did not seek transformation, she sought endurance. Her reforms were not about the future. They were about preventing collapse. And in that, she succeeded. By the end of her reign, the Habsburg state was stronger, more centralized, and more resilient than it had been when she inherited it, not because it was freer, but because it was organized. Maria Theresa did not reform to liberate her subjects. She reformed to make the empire unbreakable, and in doing so, she laid the groundwork for the modern state, even as she resisted the modern ideas that would later challenge it. For Maria Theresa, religion was never a matter of personal belief. She believed that religion was a principle of governance. Her faith shaped how she understood order, morality, obedience, and legitimacy. His reforms not only determined their direction, but also set their limits. He believed that authority came from God. This hierarchy reflected the divine order, and any deviation, moral, religious, or social, threatened stability. This belief gave him strength. It also created pressure. Unlike later Enlightenment era rulers, Maria Theresa did not embrace religious tolerance as an end in itself. She tolerated differences only when suppression became impossible. His era reveals one of the fundamental tensions of early modern governance, a modernizing state built on pre-modern beliefs. It modernized administration, taxation, education, and the military. However, control was consolidated. Catholicism was not merely supported, it was made compulsory. The Church played a central role in the areas of education, moral regulation, and social discipline. Schools taught obedience alongside literacy. Clergy reinforced loyalty to the crown and established order. Maria Theresa did not perceive this as oppression. She perceived it as compassion. According to his worldview, a moral society was a manageable society, and morality required guidance. This logic justified interference in private life. Censorship expanded. Moral courts intervened in behaviors. Sexual behaviors, family structure, and religious compatibility were regulated, not in a chaotic manner, but systematically. Here lies the contradiction at the heart of her reign. Maria Theresa limited the institutional power of the Church when it conflicted with the state. She subordinated ecclesiastical authority to imperial oversight. She dissolved monasteries deemed unproductive, yet she reinforced religious discipline over the population. The Church was controlled. Belief was compulsory. This dual approach reveals her governing philosophy. Institutions must serve the state. Individuals must serve order. Her intolerance was most visible in her treatment of religious minorities. Protestants were pressured into conformity. Jewish communities faced surveillance, restriction, and expulsion. These policies were not driven by personal cruelty. They were driven by fear of fragmentation, fear of instability, fear that difference weakened cohesion. Maria Theresa ruled an empire composed of many languages, customs, and regions. Religion, in her mind, was the final line of unity. Uniform belief simplified governance, so she chose control over pluralism. This places her uneasily between eras. She embraced rational administration. She expanded education. She professionalized governance. But she resisted the Enlightenment's challenge to authority itself. She accepted reason as utility. She rejected skepticism. Reason was acceptable, as long as it did not question hierarchy. This tension became increasingly visible in her relationship with reform-minded advisors and even her own son. She urged caution. She feared rapid change more than stagnation, because for her the state was always fragile. Order had to be defended. Discipline had to be maintained. Freedom in excess was dangerous. To modern readers, her reign appears contradictory, progressive in structure, conservative in spirit. But within her historical context, it was coherent. She did not believe in emancipation. She believed in responsibility. She did not imagine rights as inherent. She imagined duties as essential. Religion provided the moral language for this vision. It justified authority. It normalized obedience. It framed hierarchy as natural. Maria Theresa did not rule through terror. She ruled through normalization. The state instructed. The church disciplined. The population complied. And yet irony followed. Education created literacy beyond intention. Administration produced awareness. Centralization exposed inequality. The very tools designed to preserve order quietly enabled critique. Maria Theresa did not intend to create the conditions for dissent. But by modernizing control, she modernized resistance. She governed to preserve the world she knew, but in doing so, she helped prepare the world that would eventually challenge it. In the second half of her reign, Maria Theresa no longer needed to prove that she could govern. Her authority became solidified, her position normalized, her power institutionalized. What remained was continuity. And in Europe, where dynasties ruled, continuity was ensured through the family. Maria Theresa's children were never merely her children. They were instruments of diplomacy, alliance guarantees, bridges between rival powers. History would later call her the Mother of Europe. This is not an emotional title. It was a geopolitical reality. He had 16 children. 10 of them survived to adulthood, and nearly all of them married into ruling families across the continent. Every marriage was planned with great care. Each union was evaluated in terms of its political consequences. Love was of secondary importance. Stability was essential. Maria Theresa did not believe that marriage existed for personal satisfaction. She believed it existed to maintain order. Her daughters were educated accordingly. They were taught skills in representation. They were taught to be resilient. They were made to adapt. Love was never promised. Duty always existed. This approach was not unique to him. However, it was implemented with particular severity because Maria Theresa understood that her own authority was being questioned, but the legitimacy of her children could not be challenged. Marriage became an extension of her rule. Austria aligned itself through blood rather than conquest. Influence replaced expansion. Kinship replaced invasion. This strategy reshaped Europe's political map. Through her children, Maria Theresa connected Austria to France, Spain, Naples, Parma, Tuscany, and beyond. Borders softened where alliances hardened. But this web of relationships came at a cost. Her children, especially her daughters, bore the weight of expectation without agency. They were transferred between courts like living treaties. Their bodies symbolized peace. Their obedience ensured stability. Maria Theresa was not blind to their suffering. Her letters reveal concern, frustration, even tenderness. But compassion never outweighed necessity, because for her the state did not exist to protect happiness. It existed to prevent collapse. The most famous of her daughters would later become a symbol of excess and downfall. But within Maria Theresa's lifetime, she was not a cautionary tale. She was a successful alliance. This distinction matters. Maria Theresa measured success not by personal outcome, but by political function. If a marriage secured peace, it was justified. If a daughter endured discomfort, it was unfortunate, but acceptable. This logic reveals the limits of Maria Theresa's worldview. She understood power. She mastered survival. But she did not imagine autonomy as a value. Her maternal identity did not soften her governance. It reinforced it. She loved her children deeply, but she loved the empire more. This does not make her cruel. It makes her coherent, because Maria Theresa did not separate private emotion from public responsibility. She believed sacrifice was the foundation of order, and she expected her children to embody that belief. Over time, however, cracks appeared. As Enlightenment ideas spread, as younger generations questioned authority, as reform began to mean transformation rather than stabilization, Maria Theresa's methods felt increasingly rigid. Her children lived in a world she had helped create, but did not fully control. They were educated, they were mobile, they were exposed to new ideas, and some of them resisted, not openly, not immediately, but subtly. The maternal authority that had once unified the family began to strain under generational change. Maria Theresa responded not with withdrawal, but with insistence. She continued to guide, to instruct, to correct. Even as her health declined, her influence remained active. She did not relinquish control easily, because in her mind, control was care. By the end of her reign, Europe was bound together by her descendants. Her legacy was not a single border or reform. It was a network, a continent connected by obligation. This is why Maria Theresa cannot be understood solely as a ruler or a mother. She was both, simultaneously and inseparably. Her children extended her authority beyond her lifetime, but they also exposed the limits of a system built on obedience. The world was changing, and the next generation would not rule as she had. Maria Theresa had stabilized Europe through family, but she could not freeze it in time. She was the last great dynastic strategist of an old order, and the unwitting architect of the tensions that would follow. By the later decades of her reign, Maria Theresa no longer fought for recognition. She managed perception. Power, once stabilized, demanded maintenance, and in an empire as vast and diverse as hers, authority could not rely on presence alone. It had to be seen, repeated, remembered. Maria Theresa understood this instinctively. She had learned early that legitimacy, especially female legitimacy, was fragile. It could not be assumed. It had to be constructed. So she cultivated an image, not of spectacle, but of permanence. Portraiture became one of her most effective tools. Across the empire, her likeness appeared in palaces, administrative buildings, town halls, and courts. She was painted standing, seated, maternal, solemn, resolute, never playful, never ambiguous. The message was consistent, stability embodied. Her clothing in these images was deliberate, dark tones, rigid silhouettes, minimal ornamentation. Even when depicted with crowns or regalia, the emphasis was not luxury, it was authority. She did not present herself as glamorous. She presented herself as inevitable. These images traveled where she could not. They unified distant territories under a shared visual language of rule. They reminded subjects who governed them and how. This was propaganda without noise, quiet, persistent, institutional. Ceremony functioned similarly. Public appearances were carefully staged but restrained. There was no excess emotion, no theatrical dominance. Maria Theresa ruled through composure. She understood that as a woman, visible excess would be read as instability. Restraint signaled control. Even mourning became political. After the death of her husband, she adopted permanent black dress. This choice was personal, but also strategic. It communicated devotion, seriousness, and moral authority. It neutralized suspicion. It commanded respect. Her body became a symbol of continuity through loss. But image management was not limited to visuals. Language mattered. Official documents emphasized duty, order, and protection. Her rule was framed as guardianship rather than domination. She did not rule over her subjects. She ruled for them, or so the narrative insisted. This framing was crucial. It allowed obedience to feel moral rather than forced. It presented authority as care. Yet this image was selective. Dissent rarely appeared in the visual record. Hardship was minimized. Repression was invisible. Propaganda did not lie outright. It edited. Maria Theresa was not creating illusion from nothing. She was reinforcing what she wanted remembered and forgetting the rest. This approach extended to history itself. She commissioned chronicles, encouraged favorable accounts, ensured her reforms were recorded as necessity rather than control. Her reign was archived as stability achieved through wisdom, not fear, not force. And over time, this version endured. Maria Theresa became remembered as a reformer, a mother of nations, a stabilizer of Europe. Less visible were the exclusions, the silenced communities, the controlled lives beneath order. This imbalance is not accidental. Power shapes memory, and Maria Theresa was acutely aware that how she would be remembered mattered almost as much as how she ruled, because she understood something timeless. Empires do not survive only through laws or armies. They survive through narrative. By the end of her reign, Maria Theresa had secured not just obedience, but recognition. Her authority no longer required explanation. Her image had done the work, and yet image has limits. The generation that followed her would inherit the structures she built and the questions she left unanswered. They would rule in a world increasingly shaped by ideas rather than tradition, by critique rather than acceptance. Maria Theresa mastered representation, but representation could not stop change. Her carefully constructed image preserved her legacy. It could not preserve her world. She ruled by shaping how power looked. The next era would ask how power justified itself, and that question would not be answered by portraits. As the 18th century progressed, the world around Maria Theresa changed faster than she was willing to accept. The structures she had built were strong, the order she had enforced was effective, but the ideas circulating within Europe were becoming increasingly unstable. Enlightenment thought questioned tradition, hierarchy, and inherited authority. Reason was no longer merely a tool of administration, it became a tool of critique. Maria Theresa never fully embraced this shift. She admired efficiency, she valued knowledge, she supported education, but she rejected doubt, because doubt in her mind threatened cohesion. This resistance defines the limits of her reign. Her reforms modernized the state, but they did not modernize power itself. Authority remained vertical, participation remained restricted, obedience remained essential. To her critics, both contemporary and modern, this marks a failure. She strengthened bureaucracy but limited freedom. She expanded literacy but constrained thought. She improved administration while preserving inequality. These criticisms are not misplaced. Maria Theresa did not imagine a society of citizens. She imagined a society of subjects. And yet, judging her solely by modern standards obscures something essential. She ruled an empire that could easily have collapsed. She governed in a moment of transition, not arrival. The Enlightenment had not yet become dominant. Revolution was not yet inevitable. Her priority was survival, and survival demanded caution. Maria Theresa feared what she could not control, not because she was irrational, but because she understood how fragile her empire was. Diversity was already a challenge. Fragmentation was a constant risk. To loosen authority too quickly felt irresponsible. This is where her conflict with the next generation becomes most visible. Her son Joseph II pushed for rapid reform. He questioned tradition. He challenged religious authority. He sought uniformity through reason rather than belief. Maria Theresa resisted him, not because she rejected reform, but because she feared its pace. She believed change had to be absorbed slowly, that society needed discipline before freedom. That order preceded progress. This tension was never fully resolved. Their shared rule was marked by disagreement, compromise, and quiet struggle. It symbolized a broader historical shift from stability as the highest value to freedom as a demand. Maria Theresa stood firmly on the side of stability. Modern interpretations often struggle with this. Some frame her as a proto-feminist icon, a woman who ruled successfully in a man's world. Others see her as an authoritarian conservative, resistant to tolerance and pluralism. Both readings are incomplete. Maria Theresa did not rule against her time. She ruled within it. She did not seek to dismantle hierarchy. She sought to occupy it. Her significance lies not in her ideals, but in her performance of power. She proved that female rule was possible without rewriting the system that resisted it. This achievement is both impressive and limited. She opened no doors intentionally, but by standing in power for 40 years, she made exclusion harder to justify. Her reign destabilized assumptions, even as it reinforced structures. This paradox defines her legacy. She is remembered as a reformer, but not a liberator, as a mother, but not a nurturer, as a stabilizer, but not a visionary of freedom. And yet, without her, the Habsburg Empire might not have survived long enough to face the modern age at all. History does not only advance through revolution, sometimes it advances through containment. Maria Theresa contained collapse. She delayed transformation. She absorbed pressure. She held the empire together long enough for the next era to arrive. Whether that delay was protection or repression remains an open question. And perhaps that is the most honest conclusion. Maria Theresa cannot be simplified. She governed through contradiction. She ruled through restraint. She modernized without liberating. Her reign forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth that stability and justice do not always align, that progress can coexist with control, and that power, even when exercised skillfully, always leaves something unresolved. When Maria Theresa died in 1780, Europe did not enter a new age overnight. There was no immediate rupture, no sudden liberation, no dramatic collapse. What followed was continuity, strained, adaptive, and increasingly contested. And that continuity was her final achievement. Maria Theresa did not leave behind a finished vision of the future. She left behind a system strong enough to outlive her. This distinction matters because legacy is often confused with intention. But history measures impact, not aspiration. Maria Theresa never sought to be remembered as a visionary. She sought to be indispensable, and she was. The state she inherited was vulnerable, fragmented, and precarious. The state she left behind was centralized, administratively coherent and resilient, not free, but functional. Her legacy lies in this transformation. She demonstrated that authority could be stabilized without conquest, that reform could occur without revolution, that governance could be modernized while tradition remained intact. This made her reign appear conservative, and in many ways it was. But conservatism in her context was not stagnation, it was strategy. She governed at the edge of collapse and chose containment over experimentation. She delayed transformation to prevent disintegration. In doing so, she created the conditions in which transformation would later occur. This is the paradox of her legacy. The institutions she strengthened, education systems, bureaucracies, centralized administration, would eventually empower critique, dissent, and reform beyond her control. She did not intend this outcome, but she enabled it. Her reign reveals how modern states are often born not from ideals, but from fear of failure, fear of fragmentation, fear of disorder, fear of loss. Maria Theresa ruled through fear, disciplined by responsibility. This is why she remains difficult to categorize. She was not a revolutionary. She was not a liberator. She was not an ideologue. She was a manager of survival. As a woman in power, her legacy is equally complex. She did not challenge patriarchy as a system. She did not advocate equality. She did not imagine female autonomy as a political goal. And yet, she ruled visibly, persistently, and effectively for 4 decades. Her existence alone destabilized assumptions. She forced European politics to accommodate female authority, even if it refused to redefine it. She made the question unavoidable, not whether a woman could rule, but how long resistance to that fact could last. Modern audiences often seek heroes or villains. Maria Theresa offers neither. She offers a case study, a study in power exercised without illusion, in reform enacted without idealism, in authority sustained without liberation. Her reign asks uncomfortable questions that remain relevant today. Is stability a virtue if it requires control? Can reform coexist with repression? Does survival justify limitation? There are no simple answers. Maria Theresa did not resolve these tensions. She lived inside them, and that may be her most honest legacy. She represents the moment before transformation becomes inevitable. The ruler who holds the structure, together just long enough for history to change course. Not a beginning, not an ending, but a threshold. And standing at that threshold, Maria Theresa did not look forward. She looked inward, toward order, continuity, and duty. History moved on anyway, but it did so on foundations she helped build. That is what she represents today. Not freedom realized, but collapse postponed. Not justice achieved, but survival secured. And sometimes, in history, that is the difference between disappearance and endurance.